What happens when a man who has conquered the world is forced to confront the one person who knows he built his kingdom on a foundation of sand? Not a corporate rival, not a jilted lover, but the girl he left behind, now a woman in a waitress's apron, serving him champagne he can't truly enjoy. Julian Vance, the 28-year-old architect of the global logistics empire, Vance Meridian, had spent a decade meticulously erasing his past. The dirt-poor, ambitious boy from Harmony Creek, Indiana, was a ghost, replaced by a titan of industry whose name was whispered with a mixture of awe and fear in boardrooms from New York to Tokyo. But tonight, in the glittering expanse of the Pinnacle, a restaurant that revolved 70 floors above the city, that carefully constructed world was about to be shattered by the quiet arrival of a ghost he thought he'd long since buried. When he sees Clara May Thompson, her hand steady but her eyes holding the weight of 1,000 forgotten promises as she fills his water glass. The gilded cage he calls a life begins to buckle. He could lift her out of her world of struggle with a single phone call. Instead, paralyzed by a shame so deep it feels like ice in his veins, he offers her the most profound insult of all: the silence of a stranger. The world of Julian Vance was a universe of calculated silences and leveraged power. From his corner office, which occupied the entire top floor of the Vance Meridian Tower, Chicago spread out beneath him, not as a city of souls, but as a complex network of shipping lanes, warehouses, and distribution hubs, a living map of his dominance. He had traded his youth for a net worth that defied comprehension and an isolation that was just as vast. His days were a relentless symphony of acquisitions, risk assessments, and strategic decisions that could reroute global trade. His heart, if he still possessed one, was the coldest asset in his portfolio, locked away and appreciating in the sterile silence of his success. Tonight was the culmination of his life's work. He was at the Pinnacle, a restaurant so exclusive that its reservation list was a subject of financial gossip columns. The decor was a masterpiece of understated opulence: brushed bronze, dark mahogany, and lighting so perfectly engineered it made every patron look like a figure in a Renaissance painting. He was here to finalize the acquisition of Finch Logistics, a move that would grant him a monopolistic chokehold on North American freight. Across the table sat Alistair Finch, a man in his late 50s with the predatory smile of a crocodile and a reputation for corporate raiding that made even Julian wary. Julian's driver, a former Secret Service agent named Marcus, who had been with him for 3 years and had learned to communicate through subtle shifts in his employer's posture, brought the armored Maybach to a silent stop at the private entrance. "We've arrived, Mr. Vance." Julian offered no reply, his focus already on the battlefield of the dining table. This wasn't just about absorbing a competitor, it was about legacy. It was the final, decisive move that would make the Vance name immortal in the annals of commerce. He stepped from the car, the crisp autumn air a welcome shock against his skin. A discreet maître d' greeted him with a bow of the head. "Mr. Vance, a pleasure. Mr. Finch is awaiting you at your preferred table." Julian gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. His preferred table was an isolated booth with a commanding view, a throne from which he could survey his kingdom. As he moved through the dining room, the low hum of conversation faltered. Heads turned, not with the vulgarity of celebrity spotting, but with the quiet, respectful acknowledgement of true power. He was a force of nature, and this was his element. Alistair Finch was already seated, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He was a study in old money arrogance, from his Patek Philippe watch to the custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than the car Julian had just exited. "Julian!" Alistair boomed, rising to extend a hand. His grip was a test of strength, a primitive display of dominance. "Good to see you. Ready to carve up the world?" "Let's ensure the scallops are fresh first, Alistair," Julian replied, his voice a low, cool baritone that never rose and never broke. He slid into the buttery leather of the booth, his gaze sweeping the room with a practiced air of casual ownership. Everything was exactly as it should be, perfect, predictable, and devoid of messy human emotion. He was in control. Here, in this revolving temple of wealth, he was God. A server approached, a young man with a nervous tremor in his hands. "Good evening, gentlemen. May I offer you some water to begin? We have Icelandic glacial or alpine spring." "Glacial," Julian said, his eyes on the skyline. Alistair chuckled, a sound like gravel grinding. "Bring us a bottle of the 78 Montrachet. And for God's sake, son, try not to look so terrified. We're celebrating the death of competition, not mourning it." The young waiter paled and scurried away. Julian felt a familiar flicker of distaste for Alistair's brutish tactics. Power that needed to be announced wasn't real power. But he held his tongue. The deal was paramount. The people who populated his world, the drivers, the waiters, the assistants, were simply cogs in the vast, intricate machine of his life. He had spent 10 years training himself not to see them as people, but as functions. It was a necessary survival skill, a callus he had carefully cultivated over his heart, and it was a skill that was about to fail him spectacularly. Clara May Thompson believed that Saturday nights were a special kind of purgatory. For 7 hours, she would navigate a minefield of entitlement, performing a ballet of service for people who saw her not as a person, but as a pair of hands. At 22, her life was a tightrope walk over a chasm of debt. Her days were spent in classes for a forensic accounting degree she was paying for one grueling shift at a time, and her nights were spent here, smiling through the exhaustion, each tip a small sandbag against the flood of her mother's medical bills. Her dreams of attending the University of Chicago on a full scholarship had evaporated 4 years ago, the day her mother was diagnosed with a rare autoimmune disorder. Clara had stayed home in Harmony Creek, working 2 jobs to keep their small house from foreclosure, putting her own future on hold. After her mother's condition stabilized last war, she had finally moved to Chicago, determined to reclaim her life, even if it meant starting from the bottom. Tonight, she'd been assigned Section C, which included the infamous Table 7, the secluded power booth. Normally, a table like that was a gift, a promise of a tip that could cover a month's worth of textbooks. But tonight, the reservation was under the name Vance. Her manager, a perpetually frantic man named Jean-Pierre, had pulled her aside, his face grim. "Clara, you have Vance tonight. This is not a table. It is a holy sacrament. Mr. Vance is the reason this restaurant exists. You will be perfect. You will anticipate. You will not speak unless spoken to. You will be invisible. Is that clear?" "Crystal, Jean-Pierre," she'd replied, her stomach clenching. She'd followed Julian Vance's meteoric rise with a detached, painful fascination. It was like watching a rocket launch from the ground when you were supposed to be in the cockpit. She remembered a different Julian, a lanky, brilliant boy with mismatched socks and a mind that saw the world in patterns and systems. The boy who had been her only friend, her partner in a tiny business they'd called Second-Hand Time, restoring and selling antique clocks and music boxes from his father's dusty garage. That boy was gone, replaced by a chiseled, cold-eyed magnate on the cover of Forbes, a man whose gaze seemed to hold no memory of her at all. When the young waiter from their table returned to the service station, looking as though he'd seen a ghost, he whispered to the staff, The guy with Vance just ordered the 78 Montrachet. He said they were celebrating the death of competition. A wave of icy dread washed over Clara. She smoothed her apron, took a long, slow breath, and picked up her notepad. He was just a customer. It couldn't matter. It wouldn't matter. She approached the booth with her gaze fixed on the floor, her mind reciting the practiced, impersonal script. "Good evening, gentlemen. My name is Clara, and I will be your server this evening. Have you had a moment to consider the menu, or may I walk you through our chef's tasting experience?" As she finished, she forced herself to look up, and her world tilted on its axis. It was him. Older, harder, the boyish warmth in his eyes replaced by a glacial stillness. But it was undeniably Julian. The planes of his face were sharper, his posture radiating an almost violent stillness. He looked directly at her, and for a nanosecond, the mask of indifference slipped. A flicker of recognition, no, of shock, widened his eyes. A ghost had just walked up to his table. She saw it. She knew she saw it. Her heart began to pound a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. "Jules," she wanted to cry out. "It's me, it's Clara May." But the moment vanished. His expression became a blank, impenetrable sheet of steel. He looked past her, through her, as if she were nothing more than a trick of the light, a piece of the restaurant's expensive decor. The man opposite him, Alistair Finch, was scrolling through something on his phone and hadn't even registered her presence. The dismissal was more brutal than any insult. It was a non-verdict, an erasure. He knew it was her, and he had made a choice. He had chosen to unknow her. All the years of quiet wondering, of nursing the dull ache of a friendship inexplicably severed, coalesced into a single, searing moment of humiliation. Here she was, in her sensible, worn-out server shoes, taking an order from the boy who had once promised they'd build an empire of their own, and he couldn't even grant her the basic dignity of a nod. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks. Her voice, when she finally found it, was a thin, brittle thing. I'll return in a moment." She turned and walked away, her legs feeling like they were made of lead. She didn't stop until she reached the chaos of the kitchen, pushing through the swinging doors and leaning against a stainless steel counter, gasping for air. The sounds of the kitchen, the sizzle of the grill, the clatter of pans, the barked orders of the chefs, faded into a dull roar. One hot tear of pure, undiluted fury escaped and traced a path down her cheek. She swiped it away with the back of her hand. She would not break. She would not give him the satisfaction. She was a professional. She would go back out there, serve them their $1,000 wine and their $500 steaks, and she would be exactly what he wanted her to be: invisible. 18 years ago, the world smelled of machine oil, old wood, and the boundless optimism of youth. The headquarters of second-hand time was Julian's father's garage in Harmony Creek, a chaotic sanctuary filled with discarded furniture and the skeletal remains of forgotten projects. But for 12-year-old Julian Vance and 10-year-old Clara May Thompson, it was the center of the universe. They were a strange and inseparable pair. Julian, the quiet, painfully awkward math prodigy, who saw beauty in the intricate dance of gears and springs. Clara May, the observant, pragmatic girl with a startlingly logical mind, who could look at a pile of rusted parts and see a finished working machine. He was the engineer, she was the strategist. He could fix anything. She could figure out how to sell it. Their shared passion was restoring complex mechanical antiques. It started with a broken cuckoo clock they'd found at a flea market. Julian had painstakingly disassembled it, cleaning every gear, while Clara May researched its origins, identifying the maker and the year it was built, discovering that a rare, misprinted faceplate made it uniquely valuable. They sold it for a $200 profit, and a partnership was born. "Look at this, Clara May," Julian would say, his eyes alight with a fire she never saw anywhere else, holding up the intricate cylinder of a 19th-century music box. "It's a system. A perfect, logical system. Every pin has to be in the exact right place to make the music. One pin is off, and you just get noise. We'll list it as a Swiss rosewood inlaid cylinder box, circa 1885, she'd reply, scribbling notes in a ledger she kept with meticulous care. "The comb is missing a tooth, so we'll need to account for that in the price. But the casing is immaculate. We can get $400 for it, maybe $450 if we find the right collector." Their bond was forged over patient, methodical work, fueled by cheap soda and a shared belief that they were smarter together than anyone else in their small town. He was the only one who didn't see her as just the quiet girl who always had her nose in a book. He saw her brilliant, orderly mind. And she was the only one who wasn't intimidated by his quiet intensity, the only one who understood that his silence wasn't arrogance, but deep, focused thought. The summer Julian turned 18, the summer before he was set to leave for Caltech on a full scholarship, was the summer their small venture was supposed to become something real. They had spent 2 years painstakingly restoring an incredibly rare automaton, a silver swan that, when wound, would dip its head to drink from a stream of twisting glass rods. It was their masterpiece. Clara May, using her uncanny research skills, had found a potential buyer, a wealthy, eccentric collector in Chicago named Alistair Finch. He was known for paying top dollar for unique pieces, but also for being a ruthless negotiator. The night before they were supposed to drive to Chicago to meet him, they sat in the garage, the finished swan gleaming under a bare light bulb. The air was thick with a mixture of triumph and impending loss. "Are you nervous?" Clara May asked, her voice small. Julian looked away from the swan, his gaze meeting hers. "Only that he'll try to cheat us." "He won't," she said, with a certainty that calmed him. "I've read every article about him. He's arrogant, but he values quality. He'll see what this is. We just have to stick to our number, no matter what." She had prepared a full dossier on the swan's provenance and a list of comparable sales, a strategy to counter any lowball offer. He was supposed to pick her up at 7 a.m. the next morning. He never came. His father, his face a mask of confusion and anger, told her Julian had taken the family's old pickup truck and left in the middle of the night. He'd left a note, a short, brutal note that said he'd gotten a better solo offer for the swan from a private dealer and that their partnership was dissolved. He'd taken their masterpiece, their shared dream, and vanished. The betrayal was a physical shock, a clean, devastating amputation of the most important friendship in her life. A week later, she saw an article in a Chicago business journal. Local industrialist Alistair Finch acquires a rare 18th-century automaton, the Silver Swan, from a gifted young prodigy, Julian Vance. Finch has also offered the young man a full scholarship and a prestigious internship at his firm. He hadn't just sold the swan, he had sold their partnership. He had sold her out for a shortcut to the life he wanted. She packed away her ledgers and her research, burying the ghost of second-hand time. She never saw Julian Vance again. Until tonight. Clara returned to table 7, her composure a fragile, carefully constructed dam, holding back a flood of emotion. She carried the bottle of Montrachet as if it were made of nitroglycerin, her hands miraculously steady. She performed the sacred ritual of the sommelier, presenting the label, uncorking the bottle with a faint sigh, pouring a taste for Alistair. Alistair swirled the pale gold liquid, sniffed it with the pompous air of a stage actor, and took a sip. "Adequate," he pronounced, waving a hand for her to pour for them both. Julian hadn't spoken. He stared out at the revolving cityscape, his jaw clenched so tightly, a muscle jumped beneath his skin. Was he thinking of the garage? Of the Silver Swan? Or was he simply calculating the cost of this inconvenient, spectral visitation? As Clara filled Julian's glass, her knuckles brushed against his hand. It was like touching ice. He didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. After Clara retreated to a safe distance, Alistair leaned in, his voice a conspiratorial rumble. "This deal, Julian, it's poetry. It's about vision. Some people have it, some don't. You take a kid from the middle of nowhere, a kid with a spark of talent, and you give him an opportunity. You shape him, you mold him, you teach him that sentiment is a liability." He took a long swallow of wine. "It's funny, you know. I remember when you first came to me with that little clockwork bird of yours. A brilliant piece of work. But you had a partner, didn't you? Some little girl. I told you then, in this world, you eat or you get eaten. You can't carry dead weight. It was the first and best lesson I ever taught you." Julian's face remained a mask of stone. "The numbers are what matter, Alistair. Let's focus on the final valuation." The words were a dismissal of Alistair, but they were a condemnation of her. Julian's silence was an endorsement. It was a confirmation of the story Alistair was telling, a story in which she was nothing but dead weight. Standing by the service station, Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "He's talking about me, and Julian is letting him." The dinner became a master class in psychological torture. Every time Clara approached the table, Alistair would make a thinly veiled comment, each one a poisoned dart aimed at her through Julian. "Ambition is a hungry beast," Alistair mused, dissecting a lobster with surgical precision. "It requires sacrifice. You have to be willing to cut away the parts of your past that hold you back. Friendships, loyalties. They're anchors when you're trying to fly." Each word was a hammer blow against the fragile dam of her composure. Clara focused on the tablecloth, on the precise angle of a fork, on anything but the two men whose conversation was stripping her bare. She could feel Julian's eyes on her, but his gaze offered no comfort. It was cold, appraising. Was he judging her life? Was he silently congratulating himself on making the right choice all those years ago? Inside Julian's mind, a hurricane was raging. Seeing Clara May had ripped a hole in the fabric of his reality. She was the one variable he had never accounted for, the one debt he had never been able to repay. Alistair's gloating was a grotesque parody of the truth. He had taught Julian that lesson. He had seen the raw talent in the boy who showed up with the swan and had systematically poisoned him against the partner he'd left behind, convincing him that Clara May would have held him back, that she lacked the killer instinct necessary for success. Julian had swallowed that poison, let it fuel his ruthless climb. Seeing her now, serving him wine, was a twisted, agonizing validation of that choice. He had to remain cold. He had to be the man he had become. The deal was everything. "Tell me," Alistair said, looking directly at Clara as she refilled his water glass, his eyes glittering with malice. "What does a girl like you dream about? A bigger apartment? A reliable car? Or do you not have time for dreams?" Clara's spine went rigid. She kept her eyes lowered, her voice a perfectly modulated, professional whisper. "Is there anything else I can get for you, sir?" "No," Alistair sneered. "I think you've given us quite enough for one evening." She retreated, humiliation a hot flush on her skin. She chanced one last look at Julian. He was staring down at the acquisition documents spread on the table, his expression one of absolute, unwavering focus. His silence was no longer just an endorsement. It was a fresh betrayal, layered on top of the old one, and the weight of it was becoming unbearable. The main courses were done, the plates cleared away in a silence that crackled with unspoken history. Clara's movements were now purely mechanical, a defense mechanism against the splintering of her own sanity. She just had to get through dessert. Just coffee. Just the signing of the check. Then she could go home and fall apart. She approached the table with a silver tray holding a pitcher of ice water and 2 fresh glasses. Her mind was a maelstrom, flashing between the scent of machine oil in the garage and the smug, cruel face of Alistair Finch. She was so lost in the past that she didn't see Alistair subtly, almost imperceptibly, extend his foot into her path. Her ankle caught. The world tilted. In a horrifying, cinematic slow motion, the tray tipped, the pitcher slid, and a torrent of ice-cold water sluiced across the table, directly onto the sensitive screen of Alistair Finch's open tablet and the priceless acquisition documents laid beside it. Silence. A dead, perfect vacuum of sound. Alistair looked down at the puddle spreading across his billion-dollar deal, his face turning a blotchy, apoplectic shade of red. "You incompetent little fool!" he roared, leaping to his feet. Every head in the restaurant snapped towards their table. "Do you have any idea what you've done? These are irreplaceable!" I'm so sorry, sir," Clara stammered, her face burning with shame. "It was an accident. I tripped." "An accident?" Alistair spat, his voice dripping with venom. "This is gross incompetence. I want your manager. I want you fired. People like you have no business being within 100 feet of men like us." Clara stood frozen, the empty pitcher dangling from her hand, the collective stare of the room, a physical force pressing down on her. She looked at Julian, a final, desperate plea in her eyes. "Say something, please. For the boy you used to be. Say something." Julian watched the scene with an unnerving calm. His face was unreadable, his posture as still as a statue. He did not look at Alistair. He looked at Clara, and in his eyes she saw nothing. No recognition, no empathy, no flicker of their shared past. Only the cold, hard calculation of a man assessing a minor, inconvenient variable. His silence was his final answer. "You are not my problem. You are nothing." And that was it. The dam didn't just break, it vaporized. The years of quiet grief, the crushing weight of her responsibilities, the searing humiliation of this night, it all ignited into a single, clarifying blast of pure, cold rage. A rage at Alistair for his cruelty, at Julian for his cowardice, and at herself for ever mourning the loss of a boy who had so clearly never existed. Jean-Pierre, the manager, was scurrying over, his face ashen. "Mr. Finch, my deepest apologies. We will handle everything, of course." But Clara held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. She placed the pitcher down on the tray with a quiet, deliberate click. She straightened her shoulders, and when she looked up at Alistair Finch, her eyes were no longer apologetic. They were clear, steady, and blazing with an intelligence he could not possibly comprehend. "No," she said, her voice quiet, but ringing with an authority that cut through the restaurant's shocked silence. "Don't apologize for me, Jean-Pierre." She shifted her gaze from Alistair, dismissing him, as one might a buzzing fly, and locked eyes with Julian. The entire world seemed to shrink to the space between them. "You know," she began, her voice gaining strength. For a man who built an empire on logistics and identifying systemic weaknesses. You have a remarkable blind spot, Jules. The childhood nickname, a name no one had spoken aloud in a decade, struck Julian like a physical blow. The mask of cold detachment finally cracked, revealing a flicker of stunned shock. Clara wasn't finished. 15 years of repressed truth came pouring out. You sit in this tower, looking down on the world like it's a chessboard, moving pieces and acquiring assets. You think you see everything, but you can't even see the rot right in front of your face. "What is she babbling about?" Alistair demanded, looking between them with growing unease. "Julian, control your staff." Clara ignored him, her focus entirely on the man who had abandoned her. "We had a system, you and I, in a dusty garage. It was called second-hand time. We took broken things and made them whole again. We understood how things worked, down to the smallest gear. Do you remember that? Or did you file it away under dead weight?" Julian was paralyzed, the blood draining from his face. The name of their tiny business was a key to a room in his memory he had sealed shut long ago. "You took our swan and you ran," she continued, her voice trembling not with weakness, but with the force of her conviction. "You let me believe for 10 years that you sold me out for a shortcut. But that's not the whole story, is it? He taught you your first lesson." She gestured with her chin toward Alistair. "He taught you to cut out the partner who did all the research, who found the buyer, who knew the real value of what you had." "This is preposterous," Alistair blustered, trying to mop up the water with a napkin. "The girl is hysterical. Have her removed." "Am I?" Clara challenged, a bitter smile on her lips. "I spent the last 2 years studying forensic accounting, Mr. Finch. I see patterns in numbers that other people miss. It's a skill I've had since I was a kid. I used to use it to spot fake hallmarks on antique silver. Now I use it to spot criminals." She took a step closer to the table, her eyes burning into Julian's. "While your esteemed guest was pontificating about ambition, he was also scrolling through his tablet, the one I just accidentally destroyed. He was showing you figures from a subsidiary. Finch Atlantic Holdings. I saw them, upside down and from 6 feet away. I also saw the transfer logs to a series of shell corporations. The numbers didn't balance. They were off by a factor of 10, consistently, across 3 different quarters. It's a classic bust-out scheme." Julian stared at her, his mind reeling. His own due diligence team had spent 6 months vetting Finch Logistics. They'd found nothing. "He's bankrupt," Clara stated, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "Finch Logistics is a hollowed-out shell. He's been cooking the books for years, siphoning assets offshore. He's not selling you a company, Julian. He's selling you his debt. He's using your acquisition money to pay off his creditors before the whole thing collapses, and then he's going to disappear. This isn't an acquisition, it's a heist, and you're the mark." She then turned her full, blazing attention to Alistair Finch, whose face had gone from red to a waxy, corpse-like grey. "I even recognized one of the Shell Corporation names, Signe Argente LLC. That's French for Silver Swan. You're not just a liar and a thief, Mr. Finch. You're a sentimental one. You named your money laundering front after the very thing you stole to start your career of treachery." How poetic. The silence in the pinnacle was absolute. The truth of her words, delivered with the irrefutable logic of a mathematical proof, hung in the air, sharp and glittering and terrible. The entire, carefully constructed world of Julian Vance, the foundation of his empire and the justification for the man he had become, was not just built on a past betrayal, but was about to be annihilated by a present one. and the only person who had seen it, the only person who could save him, was the girl he had discarded like a broken part. The name, Signe Argentée LLC, landed in the center of Julian's mind like a precision-guided missile. It detonated a chain reaction of memories, illuminating a dark corner of his own due diligence report he had dismissed as insignificant. It was a minor offshore entity, listed as a dormant holding company for international art acquisitions. His team had flagged it as unusual, but ultimately immaterial to the deal's core financials. They had missed it. His whole multi-million-dollar team of experts had missed what a Waitress had seen in a fleeting glance at a tablet screen. He remembered Alistair's slick reassurances. "Just a little private collection, my boy. A passion project. Keeps the wife happy." He remembered the numbers she quoted, the factor of 10 discrepancy. It was a simple, elegant fraud. Too simple, too elegant. His team had been looking for a complex algorithm of deceit. Alistair had been using basic arithmetic. He looked from Clara May's blazing, righteous face to Alistair's, which had crumpled into a mask of pure, cornered panic. The bravado, the condescension, the predatory charm, it all dissolved, revealing the pathetic, sweating fraud underneath. Then Julian looked at Clara May. Really looked at her, for the first time in a decade. He saw past the server's uniform and the exhaustion in her eyes. He saw the brilliant, fiercely logical girl from the garage, the girl who saw the patterns no one else could, the girl who had always been his better half, and he was gut-punched by a single, devastating realization. He hadn't just left her behind. He had left his own judgment, his own intuition, his own soul, back in that dusty garage with her. While he was out conquering the world, he had been operating at half capacity, blinded by the very arrogance Alistair had taught him. The $3 billion deal, the legacy, the monopoly. It all turned to smoke and ash. He had been moments away from the single greatest failure in corporate history, a mistake that would have made him a laughingstock, and he had been saved by the dead weight he had cut loose 10 years ago, with a calm that was far more chilling than any explosion of anger. Julian slowly reached into his suit jacket and pulled out his phone. He placed it on the table and tapped the speakerphone icon. "Marcus," he said, his voice level and cold. "Yes, Mr. Vance," the voice of his head of security replied instantly from the phone. "The deal is off. Alert my legal team. Full asset freeze on everything related to Finch Logistics and instruct them to contact the SEC's Enforcement Division immediately. The primary targets for investigation are Alistair Finch and a shell corporation named Signe Argentée LLC. I am sending you a photo of the documents on the table. I want them preserved as evidence." Alistair lunged for the papers, but Julian was faster, his hand clamping down on the wet mess like a vice. "Don't," he said, the single word carrying the weight of a death sentence. "Julian, wait," Alistair stammered, his voice a pathetic wheeze. "This is a misunderstanding, a ridiculous fantasy from a disgruntled employee." "There is no misunderstanding," Julian said, his eyes like chips of obsidian. "You tried to sell me a ghost. You forgot I started my career with someone who knows how to spot them." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Furthermore, my team will be re-examining the provenance of a certain 18th century automaton in your collection. I have a feeling the original bill of sale might be problematic." A collective gasp went through the nearby tables, whose occupants were now openly staring. "You can't," Alistair whispered, his empire crumbling around him in real time. "Get out," Julian commanded, his voice dropping to a low growl that was more potent than any shout. "Get out of my restaurant." Alistair Finch, utterly broken, stumbled backward. He shot Clara a look of pure, venomous hatred before turning and practically running from the dining room, a disgraced emperor fleeing his own Colosseum. The room remained silent, the air thick with the fallout. The other diners quickly looked away, suddenly fascinated by their bread rolls. It was just Julian and Clara, standing in the wreckage of two different lifetimes. The king had been saved, his kingdom secured. But all he felt was the vast, echoing emptiness of his 10-year mistake. He had built a fortress of solitude and called it success, and he was its only prisoner. With Alistair gone, the silence that fell over the table was heavier than any sound. The ambient chatter of the restaurant had not yet resumed. It was as if the entire room was holding its breath. Jean-Pierre, the manager, hovered at a distance, his expression a mixture of terror and awe. Julian gave him a curt, dismissive wave, and the manager vanished, shooing away the other curious staff. He was alone with Clara May, the woman who had just saved his empire and, in the same breath, exposed the rotten foundation upon which it was built. He looked at her, at the defiant tilt of her chin, the unshed tears of anger and hurt glistening in her eyes, and the powerful CEO, the titan of industry, dissolved. He was just Jules again, the awkward, guilt-ridden 18-year-old boy from the garage. Clara May, he began, his own name feeling like a stranger's on his tongue. I don't have the words. You haven't for 10 years, Julian, she said, her voice flat and hollowed out. The fire was gone, banked by a soul-deep exhaustion. She began to turn away, to retreat back into the anonymous role of a server. Her job here was done. No, wait, he said, the words rushing out, raw and desperate. Please don't go. She stopped, but kept her back to him. The mess has been made. My shift is over. I need to go. It was a reflex, the only instinct he had left. He reached for the tools of his world, the ones he used to solve every problem. He pulled his platinum checkbook and a pen from his jacket. He didn't think. He just acted, scribbling a number with so many zeros it looked like a line of code. He tore out the check and held it out, pushing it across the table toward her. Here, he said, his voice strained. This is for your mother, for your tuition, for everything. Let me fix this. Clara May finally turned back to face him. Her gaze dropped to the check in his outstretched hand. It was an astronomical sum, a life-altering, dream-making, freedom-granting number. She saw a flash of a different life. Her mother's medical debt gone. No more double shifts. A future where she could just be a student, a daughter, a person, without the constant, grinding weight of survival on her shoulders. Then she looked up at his face, at the pleading, desperate hope in his eyes, and a fresh wave of profound disappointment washed over her. After all that, after everything she had just laid bare, he still didn't understand. He thought this was a problem that could be solved. He thought he could write a check and balance the ledger of his betrayal. Slowly, deliberately, she shook her head. I don't want your money, Julian. He was flawed. But this would solve all your problems. No, she replied, a sad, weary smile touching her lips. It would solve my problems. It wouldn't solve yours. She gently pushed the check back across the table. I'm not a hostile takeover for you to neutralize with a cash settlement. I'm not a line item in your profit and loss statement. I was your friend. She took a deep, steadying breath, gathering the last of her strength. The most valuable thing we ever owned wasn't that silver swan. It was trust. And you didn't sell it. You gave it away for free. A check can't buy that back. Nothing can. Without another word, she unfastened the strings of her apron folded it neatly, and placed it on the table next to his worthless check. Then she turned and walked away, her back straight and her head held high, disappearing through the service doors for the last time. She left Julian Vance, the billionaire visionary, utterly alone at his throne in the sky, with nothing but the ruins of his past and the crushing, unbearable weight of a debt he could never, ever repay. The week that followed was a blur of controlled chaos for the financial world, and a period of silent torment for Julian. He didn't go to the office. He orchestrated the corporate decapitation of Finch Logistics from his penthouse, his voice a cold, precise instrument over encrypted conference calls. The news media went into a frenzy, detailing the spectacular, overnight implosion of Alastair Finch's empire and the genius of Julian Vance, who had sniffed out the fraud at the 11th hour. They called him a shark, a visionary, a ruthless master of the game. None of them knew he had been saved by a waitress he hadn't spoken to in a decade. He sat in his vast, minimalist apartment, surrounded by glass and steel, the city lights glittering below like a sea of distant, cold stars. The folded apron Clara had left on the table sat on his polished granite countertop. It was a more potent symbol of his failure than any market downturn. He had replayed their final conversation 1,000 times. "It would solve my problems. It wouldn't solve yours." She was right. He had tried to patch a wound of the soul with a bandage of money. It was the only tool he had. He had to do something different, something that wasn't a transaction. He tasked his private security team, not his financial analysts, with creating a dossier. Not on a company, but on a person. Within 2 days, he had a full picture of Clara May Thompson's life for the past 10 years. It was a quiet epic of sacrifice and resilience. The 2 jobs in their hometown to pay for her mother's experimental treatments, the local community college courses she took at night, her eventual move to Chicago, the straight A's in her accounting program, the grueling schedule she maintained. She hadn't just been surviving. She had been fighting. She had been clawing her way back to the future he had stolen from her. On the 8th day, he finally left his glass tower. He wasn't wearing a $1,000 suit. He was in worn jeans and a simple black pullover, a ghost of the boy from Harmony Creek. He drove himself, his sleek, black supercar looking alien and obscene as he parked it on a cracked, tree-lined street in a neighborhood he hadn't known existed. He found her apartment, a 3rd-floor walk-up in a modest brick building, and knocked. His heart hammered against his ribs with a fear he hadn't felt since his very first business loan pitch. When she opened the door, she was wearing an old college sweatshirt, her hair pulled back, a textbook in her hand. The surprise on her face was quickly replaced by a weary guardedness. "Julian, what are you doing here?" "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. She hesitated for a long moment, then gave a reluctant nod, stepping back to let him into her small, tidy apartment. It was crammed with books and smelled faintly of coffee. A photo of her smiling mother sat on the mantel. It felt more real, more alive than his entire penthouse. He didn't offer an apology. Words were cheap. Instead, he handed her a thick, bound document. "What is this?" she asked, her voice wary. "It's a restoration plan," he said. Confused, she opened it. The cover page was simple. It read, "The Second-Hand Time Foundation, a Vance Meridian Initiative." Her breath caught. Inside was not a business plan, but a proposal for a non-profit foundation. Its mission was to provide seed funding, mentorship, and scholarship opportunities to young entrepreneurs and students from underserved rural communities, kids just like they had been. It was fully endowed, with an initial operating budget of $100 million. She flipped through the pages, seeing detailed programs for STEM scholarships, small business grants, and mentorship pairings with Vance Meridian executives. She finally reached the last page, the Foundation's charter and board of directors. There were 2 names listed as co-chairs and executive directors, Julian Vance and Clara May Thompson. It came with a salary that would solve all her problems, but it wasn't a gift. It was a job, a partnership. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and shining with a storm of conflicting emotions. "Julian, I can't. It's not a handout, Clara May," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 10 years. "It's a correction. It's the writing of a system that was broken. This is what we should have been doing all along. Not just for us. For all the other kids in all the other garages who have a dream, but no way out." He took a tentative step closer. "I spent a decade building something big, but I forgot to build something good. Vance Meridian is a perfect, logical system, just like that old music box. But it has no music. It's just noise. I don't know if I can ever fix what I broke between us. But I want to try to build something new. I need a partner. Not just one who can see the numbers. I need one who can see the truth." Clara looked from the proposal in her hands to the man standing in her tiny living room. He was no longer the cold billionaire from the restaurant or the painful ghost from her past. He was just Jules, flawed and broken and asking, not for forgiveness, but for a chance to build a different future. The road ahead would be fraught with the ghosts of their shared history. Trust, once shattered, could not be instantly repaired. But for the first time in a long, long time, the future didn't feel like a battle to be survived. It felt like a puzzle to be solved, a broken thing to be made whole again. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, but this time it was not one of anger or sorrow. It was a tear of possibility. "Okay, Jules," she whispered, a small, tremulous smile finally reaching her lips. "Okay, let's get to work." 1 year later, the headquarters of the Second-Hand Time Foundation looked nothing like the imposing steel and glass spire of Vance Meridian. It occupied a restored brick and timber warehouse in a revitalized industrial district, a space that hummed with a quiet, purposeful energy. The walls weren't adorned with modern art, but with framed schematics of old inventions and photographs of the students and young entrepreneurs the foundation was supporting. Sunlight streamed through vast, mullioned windows, illuminating a collaborative space where ideas, not stock prices, were the currency. Clara May Thompson, co-chair and executive director, moved through the space with a calm, focused grace. The haunted, weary look was gone from her eyes, replaced by a bright, clear-eyed confidence. Dressed in sharp, practical business attire, she was leading a review panel, assessing grant applications from a new cohort of candidates. Her mother, whose health had improved dramatically with access to the world's best specialists, now volunteered at the foundation's front desk 3 days a week. Clara's mind, once consumed with the calculus of survival, was now dedicated to the architecture of hope. "The financial projections on this hydroponics proposal from Ohio are solid," she said, pointing to a screen. "But their distribution plan is a weak point. Let's connect them with our logistics team at Meridian. See if we can help them build a more robust model." She didn't just give out money. She connected the pieces, built the systems, just as she had always done. Across the large, open room, Julian Vance was huddled with a group of high school students who had won a robotics competition the foundation sponsored. He was on the floor with them, his suit jacket off and his sleeves rolled up, sketching a design modification on a whiteboard. The change in him was startling. The icy wall of his control had melted, replaced by a patient, engaged intensity. He still ran his global empire, but he had delegated much of the day-to-day operations, installing a new CEO he trusted. His real work, the work that lit up his eyes, was here. He listened more than he spoke, a skill he was slowly, painstakingly relearning. He laughed at a joke one of the students made, a genuine, uncalculated sound that had been absent from his life for a decade. Later that evening, long after the staff and students had gone home, the two of them stood in their shared office, a simple, glass-walled room that looked out over the city. They were reviewing the Foundation's first annual report. 117 scholarships funded, 42 small businesses launched. Clara read aloud, a small smile on her lips. "It's a good start." "It's a start," Julian agreed, leaning against a bookshelf, looking at her. He paused, his expression turning serious. "I still think about that night at the Pinnacle. What I let happen. What I almost let happen." Clara turned from the window to face him. The space between them was no longer a chasm of betrayal, but a quiet, comfortable silence built on a year of shared work and rediscovered respect. "I think about it too," she admitted. "But I also think about the day you showed up at my apartment. You didn't offer me a check to make the past go away. You offered me a chance to build a better future. That was the day that mattered." He finally met her gaze, and in her clear, steady eyes, he saw not forgiveness, that was too simple a word, but acceptance. It was a form of wealth more real and more valuable than anything his fortune could buy. "We finally got the system right, Clara May," he said, the name flowing with the easy familiarity of their childhood. She smiled, a bright, unguarded expression that transformed her face. "We were always good at fixing things," she replied. "This one just took a little longer." Together they turned back to the window, partners in every sense of the word, watching the city lights glitter below. It was the same view as from the top of his tower, but it was no longer a kingdom to be ruled or a battlefield to be won. It was a world of connection, of promise, of countless lights waiting for their chance to shine. And this time, they would be there to help them,